Well, ladies and gentlemen, maybe we should make a start. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming to this session, which is an unusual session. I gather you've had a wonderful day, and it's a really important topic you've been addressing. So I was very pleased to hear that that's the case. And this session is going to be slightly unusual, and I hope in a way that's constructive and interesting. My name is Matt Danko, and I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise Media. And just to give you a rundown on what that is, if you haven't heard of it, it's a new startup that was established by James Harding, former Times editor and director of news at the BBC, and Katie Vanek-Smith, former president of Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, and Matthew Barson, who is a former US ambassador to the UK and Sweden. And the objective of Tortoise has been, under the general banner of slow news, which I think is slightly misunderstood, to try and get behind the headlines and the kind of bombardment of digital data, and to look at the deeper stories in a more considered and reflective way, all part of the project that I think a lot of journalists feel themselves engaged in professionally and personally, to regain trust in the media, but also to provide a balanced form of news that really did offset the way in which much news is now configured. And we started producing content online in January, and we launched formally in April, and things are going extremely well. We're based up in Fitzrovia. But one of the kind of central offerings of Tortoise is that we have moved from the sort of traditional media event model to what we call ThinkIns, which is just something that James, who, having been an editor in various places before, had kind of had in the back of his mind for a long while, which was, wouldn't it be interesting to configure discussions and debates in the form of an editorial conference? And I think his reasoning there was that there was too much adversarialism in debates, and also that there was not enough sense of contribution from people who were, so to speak, not on the panel. So we moved away completely from the panel model towards a much more inclusive model based entirely on what an editorial conference would be like. And so there's only one rule in a ThinkIn, which is that you can't ask questions, which is completely turns on its head the old idea of the media event. Contributions only. And so I'll be asking you simply to say who you are, first name is fine, and then offer your own thoughts on what we're talking about. Now, just a bit of housekeeping. How this works is we'll speak for an hour, and my colleague Ellie from Tortoise will operate Agatha, who is our in-house Tortoise. And Agatha moves for an hour, over the course of an hour, much like the country, from the left to the extreme right. And you'd be surprised how fast that hour goes. So keep an eye on Agatha, because she creeps, but she creeps quicker than you'd think. When Agatha has reached the Johnsonian terminus at the end, a flag will go up, and that will be the end of the hour. And I will try, as chair-stroke editor in this context, to sum up what I imagine will be a very, very difficult task, because I'm expecting and hoping and looking forward to a whole range of views. Now, we've sort of carried this out under the rubric of where will we be a year from now? What will it look like? But do feel free, please, in the scope of the. Do you want to start, Elia? To range a bit more broadly, because obviously I'm guessing you're full of thoughts and ideas from the course of the day. So just to sort of kick things off, I use my editor's prerogative to break the cardinal rule of the ThinkIn and ask some questions, but I do so really just to try and gauge the mood of the room. So could people put their hands up just to indicate who here believes that we will leave the EU on October the 31st? Who actually believes we will? One person, okay? Who believes that we will have left a year from today, which is October the 10th, 2020. So I would say about a third of the room. Quite interesting. Not much more. Who thinks that there should be a second referendum? Probably about a third to a half of the room. And who thinks that a general election, which now, from the briefings we're getting, seems all but inevitable, will significantly improve the likelihood of resolving the Brexit crisis? Just the Brexit crisis, not the parliamentary crisis. Who thinks that a general election will assist in sorting out Brexit? So a plucky 4 or 5 hands going up. So, okay, so interestingly, as a series of indicative votes, lots of scepticism, not a huge vote of confidence for any particular solution. Okay, so let me sort of frame the way I think it might be interesting to look at things, and then I will ask you if you want to chip in, please do. Do wait for the roving mics, though, because we're recording this. A year from now, where do people think we will be, and why? Would anyone like to begin? I mean, I will, if you like, I will offer my own. I'll throw my ha'porth to the, throw caution to the wind and throw my ha'porth in. I think that what we are now heading for is a very dangerous period around October the 30th, 31st, and some extremely constitution-risking measures which will lead us to a general election that, in all probability, will lead to the Tories having a plurality, if not a majority. And I think that is, again, another very dangerous parliamentary scenario, and I can see us on the back of that yet again facing the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. And if one was to ask the question where we'll be on October the 10th, 2020, I can easily see us not having got very far. I can't see many mechanisms in the system that will bring about huge change. I can't see the solvent. That's what I'm afraid makes me rather gloomy. Would anyone like to? Yes, sir. If you could just say your first name, or more if you want, just so that we know who you are.
Yeah, my name is Robin Horsley. I'm a social media content producer. In a year's time, where are we going to be? We're either going to be in civil war, or we're going to be in a situation whereby some very significant green shoots will be coming through, and we will realise that all the nightmare predictions were untrue, and therefore that will bring us together.
When you say civil war, do you actually mean combat and?
I mean, I think people could get killed.
Right.
Yeah, because I think there are some extremists on both sides who will resort to that, and that's the terrible risk that we face.
Why do you think that? I mean, clearly we've been through 3 years of frustration on all sides, I think, and Brexit has become a prism through which we understand much else about who we are and what we are as a country. Why has the language and the timbre of the debate become so aggressive, so angry? Why do you think that? Because you raise the point about extremism, and I mean, there's absolutely no doubt it has soared. The language and the language of betrayal and so on. I saw Verhofstadt was using it today. It has become common coin. Why do you think that is?
Because I think from very, very soon after the referendum, the campaign to go back in started, as opposed to an acceptance of the referendum as being a legitimate result. And if you read books like, for example, Nick Clegg's How to Stop Brexit, it's a blueprint for how to overturn a democratic result. And we know that with EU elections in Ireland, in Denmark, in various places across Europe, that when an election, when a vote of any type is complete, there are pre-prepared battle plans to overturn it if it's not in the EU's interests, and that's unfortunately just a fact of life. That's the landscape we live in.
Of course, Farage said if he lost, he would carry on.
Yeah, no,
referendum.
absolutely. I'm not suggesting that this is something that wouldn't happen on the other side at all. Sure. I think it would have done. I think actually though you would have had a period of retrenchment, to say the least. I don't think people like Farage were prepared. I don't think they had prepared battle plans, but certainly the people on the EU side have, because they've done it before.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Would anyone like to challenge that, or add their own thoughts? So many aspects of the debate brought in that contribution, which I think, it would be interesting to hear other views about. I mean, do people assent to the proposition that we're at the risk of serious civil disobedience and potential violence, for instance?
I think this kind of contributes to the points raised earlier today in the panels about the role politicians, journalists are playing in kind of undermining institutions that are meant to protect and defend democratic norms. And if we kind of carry on undermining the judiciary, encouraging people to ignore the rule of law, then there is a very dangerous chance of civil disobedience. And I think that's a kind of dangerous situation to be in, whichever side of the debate you're on whether it's leave or remain.
Yes, I'm really interested in this rule of law aspect, because I must say that the thing that has struck me most in the last month is that we've shifted away from a debate that's really about the merits of Brexit to a debate that's really about the institutions of the country and how they interact. And you do feel now that what is at stake is not just whether or not we leave Europe, leave the EU on October 31st, but what kind of institutional arrangement we live in internally, and whether ministers feel bound to say as a matter of instinct and reflex that they will obey the law. And that, I thought, was something that was kind of baked into what it was to be a Minister of the Crown, but it is no longer the case. It feels like much more is at stake than was previously obvious. Yes, there's a question there. Not a question, a contribution, excuse me.
A contribution, indeed.
Sorry,
coming...
can you say who you're...
Oh, sorry, my name's Christabel.
Christabel.
And I'm a data analyst, which is relevant to what I'm about to say, because me and a colleague carried out some research recently asking people whether they thought it was legitimate for the Prime Minister to suspend Parliament in order to force through a no-deal Brexit. And we got the predicted responses in the sense that Remainers thought it was terrible and Leavers thought it was great. But we also asked a question that put it in reverse. What if a Remainer Prime Minister was trying to revoke Article 50 against the will of Parliament? Would it be okay for them to suspend Parliament? And what we found was that Remainers thought this was a bad idea and Leavers thought this was a bad idea. Now, then we did something that I still think is quite clever. We arranged the survey so that the questions, the order that the questions were received in was randomised. So half the people saw the Remainer scenario first, half the people saw the Leaver scenario first. And what we actually found was that the Leavers, who thought that suspending Parliament was such a great idea, a statistically significant number of them changed their minds, or at least went to don't know, when they were presented with a Remainer Prime Minister doing the same first. So what we're suggesting is that once you point out to people that democratic norms protect you as well as protect your enemy, that this actually can lead people to have a bit of a rethink about whether it's right to force through these things against constitutional norms. So I think that this is actually, there's a lot of doom and gloom at the moment. I do think that there is, and the reason I think that Remainers tend to reject the scenario whereby it benefits Remainers is very probably because we've seen the consequences of it. We're living with the consequences of seeing a government that is trying to do that. And I think once you're exposed to those, If you actually are forced to think about it, I am actually quite hopeful that we can make it alive out of this mess. If just people are just given a bit more time to think through the consequences of some of the things that are happening at the moment.
It's very interesting because what you raised, Christopher, is sort of fits in a lot with some work that I've read about in different contexts at Dartmouth University by Brendan Nine about how you know the ways in which you persuade people of things, and if you simply hit them with the opposite case, it often leads them to entrench their own existing views, which I guess in a way is a natural psychological reflex. But there are routes to opening people's, at least developing their curiosity to the opposite point of view. But I suppose the question that your fascinating analysis raises is how you do that on a broad scale. How do you actually introduce people? Yes, did you have?
Sorry, I wasn't meaning to interrupt you.
Not at all. No. I'm much more interested to hear you than me.
No,
I know what I think.
No, I'm Dan. I'm currently at the Reuters Institute. I normally work on Newsnight. The one thing that I think came out of this morning's, this afternoon's session, which I think is worth chucking at this point, is Will from Full Fact. Sort of made the point that whilst the debate is always framed as in the sort of 48 against the 52, as if 100% of people consider themselves to be passionately one of these two categories, I just don't personally believe that reflects the national sort of
Brexit fluidity
feeling, or not even just fluidity, but actually the strength of feeling. So there's obviously some fluidity over what people think about what should happen. But I also think that to cast the debate as one of passions, entrenched or not, is that actually accurate? And I'd be interested to know if anyone here who comes from a more academic background has any figures or evidence to sort of underpin that, because, as Will said earlier, isn't the overwhelming likelihood that most people just don't really mind? They're not as engaged in it as we, as journalists and as people who study this stuff are.
I can actually. Sorry, I'll give you some figures.
Sorry, could you give your name?
Sorry, I'm still me.
Sorry, it's Christobel. Sorry, I beg your pardon, Christobel. I couldn't
Sorry,
see that.
I don't want to hog this, but I do actually have an answer. The fact is that people are quite entrenched in their Brexit identities. Most people do identify either strongly or very strongly with either Remain or Leave. But there is about sort of maybe 30% in the middle that don't. But there's something about this referendum that I think. So people don't particularly identify with political parties so much anymore, because I don't think they feel it's part of their identity. I think it's partly because the question was a direct question. It was something that you had to answer yourself. So I think people become much more attached to their answer, because then they don't want to feel, if you change your mind, it's like you've made a mistake. Whereas if you vote for a political party and then they turn out to be rubbish, you can say they let me down. Whereas actually in the referendum you have to say I made a mistake and voted the wrong way, which I think is harder. So I think there is about, say, 30% of people who don't particularly mind one way or the other. But there's a large amount of people that do, even if they don't necessarily understand all the issues. It's an emotional attachment to a certain identity.
There's certainly a fatigue, isn't there, in this? I mean, I've felt recently that Boris Johnson's greatest friend in striking a deal, or at least in persuading the public that somehow we just have to get out, is boredom. That people are actually chewing their arm off because they're so fed up of this dominating the bandwidth of governance in the country, which of course is a very dangerous emotion in the sense that, yes, it has taken a long time, and yes, it was sold as a light switch event that would happen very quickly, and it hasn't, partly because it's such a difficult thing to disentangle a country from 40 years of commercial, legal and social involvement. But the fact is that people, I think, if there's one thing that unites the country, is they're fed up with Brexit. And so there is that concern, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Dan Johnson. I think, I mean, there are two issues with that. I mean, one is that it's kind of being positioned as, right, well, we can draw an end to this, 31st of October, do or die, we get out and we move on, deal or no deal. And when clearly the situation is that this is going to dominate politics, is going to dominate discourse for many, many years to come, because we're moving on from a situation where we're negotiating with the European Union to where we're going to be negotiating our trade relationship with 27 individual member states. So this idea that we're just going to kind of draw a line and move on and we'll be able to get back to all the things that are important in people's lives, health, education, crime, et cetera, is just a complete misnomer. I think the other big issue is legitimacy, and you can come back to the point about the original poorly framed, poorly thought, and poorly communicated referendum. Theresa May, who was a disastrous political communicator, actually had one political message that kind of got through, which Brexit means Brexit, and again, it doesn't really mean anything, but actually we need to know as a nation what Brexit actually means, and then take a legitimate decision on whether we want that as a nation.
Yes. So, gentleman at the front here, and I'll come to you. Just here, and then I'll come to you.
Hello there, my name is Mark Giorgio.
Hi, Mark.
30 years at BBC, and I have an MA from City University. Sorry about that. I agree with all of that.
Not a matter to apologise for.
No, you had to be here all day. It's a running gag. I agree with everything that Dan said. Drag it back to journalism. I think that in a year's time, as journalists, we're still going to be here rightly wringing our hands over how we're failing to get information out to the public. We're going to be talking about the same old angst and not coming up with any answers. I think a consequence of that is that the young are going to abandon journalists like the ones that we are. They will find their own way. They will not watch us. They will not read us. They will not listen to us. They will do something else. And I hope and pray that it is good.
Just before you, do you have any thoughts as to what it might be?
I do.
I'm serious.
No, seriously. Okay,
will it be social media?
So here's the thing, and I know it's very difficult to extrapolate from one's own children, but I'm always amazed by the fact that my children don't do email, they don't do Facebook, yes. They don't do Twitter. What they do is WhatsApp groups and Instagram and they are finding their own ways. And there's other things, TikTok and other bits and pieces, which I barely understand, coming their way. Yeah. And when I talk to them, and again, I'm completely aware of the dangers of extrapolation, they are talking to each other in ways that, frankly, we don't understand. Or I certainly don't understand. And I think somewhere in there, the way that they share things and the way they discuss things is perhaps something new and something different. Who knows?
I'm sure you're right. There was a gentleman there.
Hi, my name's Mark, and I should declare an interest in that I work for the EU. I've got a remark I want to make, but before that, just on the earlier remark that the gentleman in front made, I have to correct that. The referendum results in Denmark and Ireland were not reversed. What happened was that in Denmark, an additional international treaty was signed with Denmark, promising Denmark opt-outs in the areas which had raised concerns during that referendum campaign over Maastricht. That was subsequently honoured. After the Ireland-Lisbon Treaty result, an entire protocol was actually added to the treaty in order to meet the concerns of at least a large proportion of the Irish electorate. And as we've seen since then, far from any of that leading to violence or to a rejection of the EU, both of those countries are now probably more pro-EU than they've ever been, although in Denmark's case that's still a lot less absolute than it is in Ireland. So I just wanted to put that straight. The remark I wanted to make is that I think, ironically, given that we're talking here about avoiding simplistic solutions, we're starting from a point where any of us can say right now not only what we think will happen, but what we think should happen. What I think should happen changes from day to day. Clearly, I voted Remain. After the referendum, I thought the best solution would be leave, but with a close relationship with the EU. I'm speaking entirely personally, of course. That seemed to be off the table. If it came back, I might well support that. If I'm faced with a choice between another kind of deal and remain, I would have to think very carefully about it. If I was faced with the choice between no deal and remain or a deal, I would come down extremely strongly against no deal, because I think that would be disastrous, not just economically, but also geopolitically. So my point is that the context in which we're thinking and in which we're trying to assess our own views changes so rapidly that you almost can't say, if you're someone who's being intellectually honest with yourself, that my position today is going to be the same one tomorrow or the same one the day after that. So I think even if we have an hour, even if we have a much more illuminating discussion than usual, it's still impossible to say on this particular date. For most people, they don't know which choices they'll be faced with, and they can't be absolutely sure, people outside this room much more than people in it, how they would react in those circumstances. And that's what I think is so tragic about the media debate and how polarised it's become, and how completely dismissive of the other side's point of view it's become on all sides. But if we're talking about inciting violence, there's really, does happen a little on the Remain side, but it is almost entirely the Leave side that is talking about betrayal, collusion, treachery, all of these sorts of adjectives, the kind of thing, or nouns, the kind of thing that could actually incite people to actually take violent action. I think that is the first thing we have to stop. And I think everybody should be taking a really strong stand against that. And I'm really not sure that they are. Not strong enough, anyway. I think journalists are not taking a strong enough stand.
It's interesting that the content of the debate most of the time now is about tactics, in the sense that, you know, you'll hear people late at night on Newsnight discussing how to get round the Benn Act, or, you know, what Boris Johnson should say to the Taoiseach that will best keep him in the right position with his own backbenchers. But the content of the discussion has become more and more marginal, I feel. Yes, of course, we get every day brings a new plan. I mean, Philip Hammond was on the Today programme this morning talking about his, you know, let's all enter the customs union, and not as a consequence of backstop, but as a means of sort of giving ourselves a breathing space. And that was today's sort of offering. But I feel that the heat, the energy of media coverage is mostly devoted now to the chessboard, rather than what the prize of winning the chess game is, if you like, to stretch the metaphor. And I wonder whether that is just to address that concern about the public information role of media is a problem. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jill.
Hi, Jill.
I was just going to comment on that and partly trail some work that UK and Changing Europe is going to be publishing later in the weekend. But I think what's really interesting on that is, ever since Boris Johnson published his letter to Jean-Claude Juncker, everybody is focusing on the specifics of the proposal on Northern Ireland, which undoubtedly matter. But there's actually a really much more important sentence in that letter, which says we are aiming at a very different sort of relationship long-term with the EU to the one that the Theresa May government was aiming at. And that's why, for him, the backstop doesn't work, because it's bridging to a very close relationship, even if the Prime Minister wouldn't quite be honest with the public about how close a relationship she wanted to get into. And he's now envisaging a much more distant relationship. But hardly anyone has commented on that massive change of stance, which actually, you know, doesn't matter more than the backstop, doesn't matter more than peace in Northern Ireland and things like that, but is a huge big change of direction and has barely been picked up at all. As I said, UK Change Europe is producing some stuff at the weekend on that to try and refocus the debate. But I think it's quite interesting that people focusing on the immediate, to your point, that we're all focusing on the immediate, and do we get a deal on the 31st of October? Not what does the long-term relationship look like?
And do you think that the long-term relationship that Johnson is envisaging is of the sort of Britannia Unchained kind of deregulatory Britain, perhaps much more embedded in deals with America, or do you have a sense of why he said that? Because it must have some content to it.
So the key sentence is that he's rejected the level playing field provisions and wants the UK with regulatory freedom. Clearly, much more clearly, his international trade secretary, Liz Truss, is going around the world trying to drum up interest in deals with the UK, which would come from degrees of regulatory freedom. And I'm not sure whether Boris Johnson himself would want to use those regulatory freedoms, but he clearly wants something that gives you that option. That obviously is potentially should be a battleground in the next election, which would make even if Jeremy Corbyn is aiming for a Labour-style deal, we should have an election that is actually about the long-term relationship we want with the EU, but it actually probably will be a do we crash out with no deal or do we not, rather than the two very different visions that two parties are presenting.
Yes. Come back to you, yes. Yes.
That's me.
Yeah.
Just going back to what the chap from who works for the EU said. Look, you know, we live in a democracy. You have to implement the result. I'm afraid you can't just go back and modify the offer. You know, that's. Let's not go into too much of that. As far as free trade is, I mean, what Boris Johnson said was talking about a free trade arrangement as opposed to being in a customs union. That's the fundamental difference. And the key thing, that the sort of bedrock of the EU is the customs union. And our ability to be able to, of a future government, to be able to do trade deals around the world. Well, and I hate the word trade deals, actually, because it's not. They're just frameworks.
So to your first point,
Yeah.
you would equate modifying the offer with reversal.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's really what it is.
But they're not quite the same, are they? I mean, a reversal is where you just say, I'm sorry, your views are irrelevant. A modified offer is you say, actually, I've taken account of your views and I'm going to change the offer. They're not,
Sure.
that's not quite the same, is it?
Sure. Well, look, you have to implement the result. Sure, you can then come back with another offer subsequent to that, but you have to implement the result first. And the difficulty we've had as a nation is that we had a Prime Minister who was proposing a withdrawal deal, which didn't satisfy the majority of people in Parliament or in the country that it was a withdrawal agreement. It simply didn't stack up like.
What sort
like
of
that.
deal do you think would satisfy Parliament? And
I think the direction that Boris Johnson is going in is significantly the right one in terms of what can settle. But of course, you know, he's being derided completely so much for other things at the moment that he's going to find that a challenge.
I mean, does it? Because of course, there's an assumption that his, you know, various problems he might have had in his private life or when he was London mayor were an issue. But do you think they actually do impact upon public opinion or?
Yeah, I think they harden on the Remain side. They harden Remain opinion.
Right.
On the Leave side, I think they don't have anything like as much impact actually.
Right. Okay. Who's next? Who would like to? Yes, sir. Okay. I'll come to you.
Thank you. I'm Kei from Japanese broadcaster, NHK. I just want to raise the issue for the sake of argument that today the mainstream media might be very detached from the public. You use the word sports reporting of politics. Now, when it comes to the Brexit, you know, who said who and what commented who. But I feel like from the outsider, it is an article for inner circle to the people who understand how Westminster works and who the players are. And I'm not sure like how many people really understand the dynamics or how Westminster works in terms of public. So the reporting, sports reporting in a way, may not be reaching to the public. And the reporting is going to the journalists or only to the politicians or circulating only in the, I don't know, maybe I should use a word upper class or only certain group of people so that it's not reaching out to the public. And maybe that's one of the reasons why people Googled what is EU right after referendum. You know,
Yes.
it clearly shows the fact that vast amount of reporting about referendum was not reaching to the public. And I'm not criticizing from outside. It's the same thing is happening in Japan.
You mean that sort of insiderish?
Yes, reporters reporting to reporters.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's actually think that's a very fair criticism, and I think that one of the problems with the Brexit process that it has showed is that the difficulty in reporting often highly technical and very contentious debates like this in a way that stretches out a hand to the reader who has an ordinary life is often, or the viewer, is often extremely difficult. And I think the worst of it is when journalists are talking to one another through their dispatches, and I think that's the greatest risk, especially when the what Freud called the narcissism of small differences comes into play, which is you find that you have a slight edge on another media organisation, and so you make that your lead story, when actually the lead story is still the main story, and in a very competitive media environment, that's an undoubted risk. There was someone else. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Philip. I'm from Austria. I'm
Hi,
a
Philip.
reporter there, and right now I spend my time as a Reuters Institute fellow in Oxford. I think that from an outside perspective, I have no stakes in this game. Luckily, I have to say, because it seems really impossible to win for any side. What determines this whole situation for me as an outsider is that you seem to have a really big crisis of institutions. The media seemed to fail you as a people. Parliament has tied its hands. I don't know if it's a democracy, but still it's not very, what's not the right, not very effective for policy. The government obviously seems to have failed to deliver what was promised. So maybe it would be a good start for any institution to start an introspection and start from scratch and ask themselves, what could we do better, as we did now the whole day as journalists and media, reflecting on possible failures, things we could do better, things we could have explained better, and build trust again. I think trust is the key issue in this whole drama that unfolds on this beautiful island. I don't know. It's strange to watch as a European, I have to say.
Yes, the gentleman behind.
I could go on from that point. Thank you. I'm Jaakko Lyytinen. I'm a Finnish journalist and attending the same program as a fellow at the Reuters. I've been here for 1.5 weeks now, and I'm getting more and more confused every day.
Just wait till you've been here 6 weeks.
I won't find my way home, I guess, for Christmas. But the thing is that last weekend I was speaking to a few friends, senior historians, English historians, and one mentioned he just turned 80, and is a specialist on South African history, but he said that the tectonic plates are moving. There's very dramatic language he used. And he was saying that everybody has practically lost their sense of meaning. Political parties, media, institutions. And it felt very dramatic for a historian to speak like this. But now I find that's like the high level, and now I'd like to go and see, as a journalist, where you work on the ground level, where you try to go and find the answers, find the people, that today's discussions has also been on a high scale in a certain sense. How can we go forward and find the new answers as journalists? So I'll be very much looking into that now, for maybe not to be that confused in the near future.
So the implication of your optimism, which is very, very, very good to hear, is that the tectonic plates can be slowed if we do the right things.
well, we need to do our work as journalists. Well, I won't be doing it because I'm a fellow now for a year, but I'll be very much looking into the British journalists, finding the answers for me. I'm very interested in this.
Stuart, just to report that a number of news sources are saying that Boris Johnson and Leo Varadkar can see a pathway to a deal.
There you go. Pathway to peace. Did they elaborate on the gravelling and the tiling of the pathway, or simply that?
Progress in 3 areas: consent, customs, and regulatory alignment.
Huh. It is interesting, this, isn't it? Because I suspect this is going to happen quite a bit between now and October the 31st. Is that there will be moments of elation, and one of them may well be justified. I don't know. I mean, I can't predict it, but. It seems to me there is a desire on all sides to sort this out, but I still worry that in fact we're trying to solve an intractable problem, which is how, I mean, to take the Irish example, how do you effectively sort out the difficulty that under the auspices of the EU there was not really a border to speak of between Northern and Southern and the Republic of Ireland, and that, to an extent, I think we underestimated was key and the glue of the Good Friday Agreement. And now, in some shape or form, there has to be some form of border, whether that border exists as a single line across the map is a different matter. But it'll be very interesting to read the detail of that, because that's a substantial shift in Varadkar's language in the last 24 hours.
Laura
Yes.
Kunsberg says on exactly this, are they just being polite because nobody wants to knock it on the head yet?
Yes, because of course we are now into the blame game phase of the procedure, where no one wants to be left, holding the baby of blame, I suppose. Yes. Yes, gentleman with the beard.
Hi, my name's Matt.
Hi, Matt.
I work for Flamingo, a research agency. We recently authored a report commissioned by the Reuters Institute on how young people consume the news. I just wanted to kind of add to what we were saying about that topic a little bit earlier in the discussion about TikTok, Instagram. One of the main things we did find on this report was that there is an at least unrivaled appetite for knowing about and being informed about what's going on in the world from this audience. But as we are kind of aware of, this information is coming from many different sources, not necessarily those of us in the room at the moment. That might be through podcasts, that might be through watching a comedy show where people just chat about what's going on, that might be through influencers, vloggers, whatever it is. They will discuss these issues, even though perhaps the topic of their vlog is not traditionally the news. And therefore you feel like you do know what's going on in the world, and you feel like you can talk about it, and you have that need fulfilled, just again, not through people in this room. On the flip side of that, while there is a bit of a trust issue, we definitely saw a real engagement with the fact that the most reliable way to get that kind of information is still from the traditional news brands. There's not any certainty about quite why they're so authoritative on it, but there's heritage, there's long past years of practice in this, and there's an understanding that there must be some kind of process that goes on, which is definitely more reliable than an influencer. And therefore there is, I would say, a lot of belief in the fact that there is a lot of value in what can be offered by the audience that we spoke to, by these younger people who are, by the way, aged 18 to 34. And I would suggest that given a lot of other research that my agency has done around this audience, particularly around, for example, honesty and vulnerability being core values of this audience as they grow, and also with thoughts in mind, for example, when the National Geographic apologized for their racist reporting in the past, and that went down particularly well. And then lastly, to have come here and been quite surprised as someone who's not actually in the industry at how common a belief it is that we have failed in the way that we've reported. Everyone on the panel offering D to F as their judgment on the industry. I do pose as a provocative thing, what if a major brand did actually make an apology about the way that they behaved and the way that they reported on these issues? And perhaps, of course, then offered a solution to getting over all of this entertainment politics, or to getting over some of the other more infuriating ways that we have been reporting in the more recent past.
It's a very interesting idea. Anyone else want to chip in on that? Anyone? I mean, is there anyone else agree with the contention that there needs to be some sort of act of atonement or apology or constructive? It is something one hears, and I think it does have some power. Did you want to come back?
If nobody else wants to, I've already spoken.
Yeah, sure. That's all right.
Yeah, I mean, the first step is, when you know you've done something wrong, is to admit it, isn't it? I mean, even if actually you don't have a solution, but you're looking for one, at least that shows intent. So I think, yeah, that is an answer. And as far as younger people, do you want to go on? I mean, as far as younger people moving to different platforms, I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, this is going to change, but I think there's also. So sorry, just to clarify what I mean by that is, yeah, of course. I'm 50. My kids are in their early 20s. They spend all their time on Instagram and Snapchat.
Yeah.
That's where they get their stuff. But 10 years ago, we saw in politics, we saw political blogs dominating the landscape, and all that happened was the mainstream media colonized that landscape by employing those people. So the successful bloggers, Tim Montgomery, for example, went to become a Times journalist. Ian Dale now is a broadcaster on LBC. These were the top bloggers in the country at the time. So I don't necessarily think that the big mainstream media organisations will sort of collapse and disappear. I think they'll, to some extent, they'll probably colonise it, just like they did with the last kind of stream of technology.
Yes, it's at the back.
Dan Johnson again. I mean, Brexit's been a double-edged sword for the media, hasn't it? I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the coverage. There's been a lot of kind of almost self-flagellation about we got it wrong, we weren't plugged into the communities we should have been plugged into. But it's actually also been a huge boon for the industry. More people are kind of seeking out more quality information, and they're not just doing that via subscriptions. They're doing it via search and social as well. So you look at the FT, the Times, you look at the States, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Yeah, they've both benefited from a Brexit bump or a Trump bump. So I mean, going forward, yeah, there are challenges, but I think those strong media brands, if they continue to utilise data, if they continue to seek to explain and challenge themselves, as well as challenge kind of some of the orthodoxies in terms of how information is being kind of communicated. I mean, I think this past week hasn't been particularly good in terms of the kind of free flow of information from an anonymous briefing, aka Dominic Cummings, and how that kind of impacts on the discourse. I think Dominic Cummings probably looks at the media, the mainstream media, with more than a degree of contempt and thinks, well, they are the useful idiots to me. So how you kind of then challenge that and analyse that, I think, is of critical importance going forward.
It's a very interesting. I mean, that we still don't know for sure that it came from the pen of Dominic Cummings, although it must be said that the indications are fairly clear. Having received long messages from him myself, I would suggest there are some stylistic symmetries. But it's an interesting paradox, because obviously the normal response to it was this is a very, very bad way to conduct government, and yet it's actually to date the most interesting document on the government's real plan. So you have I wouldn't necessarily say it's entirely analogous to the tweets that Trump sends out, because it's not, but nonetheless it was incredibly informative, and it's almost like government being turned inside out, because of course, spin and briefing and so on has been absolutely part of what governments have done, well before I started writing about politics. But this is different. I mean, this is actually Cummings, let's assume, using James Forsyth, the Spectator, known to be a journalist trusted in particular on conservative politics, as a means of getting across the government's core strategy and plan on the most important issue by far in front of it, which is very different to the old idea of Alistair Campbell or Spurgeon Bingham or whoever it might be giving a columnist a call and saying, just to give you a steer. It's different. It's different in kind.
Matt, would Tortoise have published that in full?
That's a really good question, and the answer, I think, off the top of my head, is yes, but with very heavy annotation. I would regard that text or message or however you wanted to describe it as a sort of artifact that needed to be studied and analysed, and so. The way I would have presented it, if I'd been sent to me, would I recommend that we do publish it in full, because it's not the job of journalists to sit on information in some high-minded way. However, it is their job to provide it with as a service to the readers what it means. So you say this means that, this is indicating that, this suggests that, this one word is actually very significant. Yes, sir.
Yes, just to pick up on the point that was made by an earlier gentleman. I'm Jonas from the YLE, the Finnish Broadcasting Company. I'm a public editor at the company, and I'm also one of the fellows at the Reuters Institute. The question regarding whether we should apologize, I don't think we should apologize, and I definitely don't feel ashamed about what YLE has, my own company in Finland, has done concerning Brexit. But what I think also would be appreciated by a younger audience is what I call like radical transparency about being more open about the mistakes we make. Now, often that's something that is placed, in a correction on page number 12. Yes. Whereas we could be much more open about the mistakes we made, because if there's one particular thing that characterizes like YouTubers and what is appreciated by the younger audience is the authenticity of them, and they're being really, it's very plain and simple. They're not pretending to be something else, and I think that mainstream media perhaps lacks that kind of element in its reporting.
Very interesting. Yes, back to
that. I think you make an interesting point about whether it's journalism's job to sit on information. And there's a really interesting paper that's just been published by Dana Boyd about, I get the terminology right, about strategic silence within the media, and you have a kind of gatekeeping function that sometimes it's a responsible thing to choose not to report things. So one of the case studies is cited is suicide. And so you don't report the details of suicide because it leads to an increase in copycat suicides. I was at an FT event in New York earlier this year, and again, a senior person from CNN said, well, there's certain things that Trump does and says now, and we just choose to ignore it, because actually it's not adding anything. And I think they kind of some of the lessons they learned from 2016 was, well, we just stick a Trump rally up there and let it go, or we would bark at every single parked car.
Yes.
And I think that's probably a lesson that needs to be kind of reflected on, is just because someone says something, just because someone does something, it doesn't mean that it automatically is newsworthy, regardless of who that individual is.
Well, you certainly don't want to become just an unthinking pipeline, but I think that when you get a 750-word analysis by, let us assume, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, which includes threats to withdraw security and defence cooperation from the EU.
I wasn't saying
You didn't mean that specific example. Yes. No. No. Well, I mean, this has been an ongoing. I mean, I remember it being seriously argued in the Times newsroom when I was a trainee there, as to whether there was a case for not reporting IRA tax. I have to say the debate did not last long, but the argument was that by providing the IRA with the oxygen and the publicity, the media was doing its work for it. So it's an ongoing debate, this. It's a very interesting one. Yes, John.
I want to come back on the assumption that the Cummings memo is the government's strategy. Because actually I think you've all been completely played by the Cummings memo. Because I think that Number 10 is running a double strategy.
Yes.
And I think they have just used you naively to send out a bunch of saber-rattling messages about defence and security. I mean, we saw Julian Smith going on and saying, over my dead body do we withdraw security cooperation from Ireland. We're not going to do that. That's wholly irresponsible. So I think just by replaying
He didn't resign, though, did he?
He didn't resign, but it's not government official policy yet.
No.
It's not. It's just Dominic Cummings sounding off to James Forsyth.
But so was
at massive
prorogation
length.
until it happened.
So was prorogation until it happened. But I think this is why these things are so pernicious, because actually, what is the status of these things?
Well, hence
that's the real problem with these, and that's sort of not
understanding. You need to scaffold
the thing and saying, actually, if this is really your strategy, guys, put it on the record, and we'll do it as a Number 10 official spokesman, or we'll say the Prime Minister has said. And if you're happy to do it as the Prime Minister, then we'll report it. If you want to do it under the radar and stuff like that, then we won't. Which is why I think this is really difficult, because I think this is a way of getting out unaccountable message. You heard Grant Shapps refuse to take account, answer for it and things like that. And that's the real problem of just sort of giving these things so much credence, because it's a very, very easy way of getting that. And the same thing with the Merkel phone call. That was just the Number 10 using the media to get their deliberately strategic messages out rather than actually serious news. The interesting thing was they were doing it, not what they said.
I mean, I agree, and I think that's why it's so important to, if you do report something like that, to surround it with health warnings, footnotes, explanations, analysis. I always have a possibly old-fashioned neurosis about not allowing interesting information into the public domain. But I do take your point that it's easy if you follow that line to be played. And one thing is for sure, that Dominic Cummings, in everything he does, is playing. He's not a government man, he's a campaigner. In fact, what he's done is he's turned Number 10 into a campaign headquarters, with this blip between vote leave and the next election, which has really not been about government at all.
Will Moy said he thought that journalists were becoming victims of political manipulation, and he had to guard against that.
Anyone else before we... Yes.
Just very quickly to introduce something new. Do you think... we're not supposed to ask questions, so I think that there might be a role for thinking out of the box. But this is actually really a question. And having... we talked earlier about vox pops and how they don't work, about how polling is unreliable. How about having a citizens' assembly with a representative group of people, 200 or 300, including those who don't really care about Brexit as well, because as other people have said throughout today, that is a pretty large group. That was televised and web streamed live for those who wanted to watch it, and with a half-an-hour highlights package every evening for a week, curated by a neutral, non-political organisation and a non-journalistic organisation, like, for example, Full Fact, to ensure that a balanced impression of the day's discussions was given. Not necessarily in the hope that that will resolve anything, but just to see if it changed the narrative, just to see if it sees the news agenda from the kind of behaviour that Jill's just been highlighting there.
It's a very interesting point, because it seems that one of my favourite columnists, John Harris at The Guardian, said the other day in a column that representative democracy has become a very hard sell. And I think that's a very good way of putting it, because we live in a culture where direct democracy in all its forms is very much of the moment. And after all, our phones are full of apps which deliver instant gratification, and there's a much greater taste for you know, what you might call Deliveroo politics than there is for the idea of saying, I'll tell you what I want, you go out to the restaurant and bring it back, and take your time, and if you think that I'm wrong, do feel free to change my order. Representative democracy is not going through a great period, and I suspect the images from the House of Commons of people shouting at each other in the last 3 years have not done that much to gild the lily. And I'm interested in the Citizens' Assembly idea, not least because it seems to me to be a response to that perceived failure. It did work in Ireland, didn't it? I mean, it has had some success. So, anyone else before we? Yes.
I'm a bit sceptical about Citizens' Assembly. In a sense, it's just another form of representative democracy. It's just you've kind of randomly selected your representatives as opposed to elected them. I think Parliament has got quite a bad rap out of this, but actually the problem with Parliament is that they are representing the views of the British people. The British people don't know what to do. And I think the real, we are very divided. And I think the real problem with the Leave vote was that those 17.4 million people didn't all vote for the same thing. In some cases, they voted for completely contradictory things. Some people wanted, a hyper-capitalist Singapore-style country. Other people clearly, voted because they wanted the return of the coal mines. And I think, the problem with trying to get a deal through is that when you crystallise what leaving means, you're never going to have a majority for it. And so Parliament's paralysis simply reflects the paralysis of the people. And I do think a general election will change that, actually, because, either Dominic Cummings is his tactics are going to work, and I totally agree that memo was entirely a part of the general election strategy. If it does work, and due to the vagaries of first past the post, he could win a majority on a very low percentage of the overall vote, and whether we like it or not, that will resolve the situation. Or if he fails to get a majority, then we will have a majority for Remain parties, which presumably will be able to resolve the question another way. So I feel sorry for Parliament, because I think MPs genuinely are very conflicted, and many of them are genuinely trying to represent the views of a country which is just simply hopelessly divided.
It's we've got time for one more. Yes.
Sorry, reluctant to get involved, but getting involved anyway. No, I think it's just to carry on that point. I think it's interesting. Like I'm not, and people are sort of proposing citizens' assemblies and whole reforms to our democratic process. But I mean, in some ways, I think MPs haven't really known how to respond to what is essentially an action of direct democracy, as you were saying, which is a referendum vote, and then sort of trying to do their representative democracy thing on top of it. They're sort of going, oh, we know what you said. They don't really know how to deal with it to some degree. It seems that formation, that's still being sort of created, the policy of how to handle that, especially when it's something that essentially upends the status quo. So I mean, it could be an argument. It's interesting that, and it's a broad, it's people are representative of all different people in Parliament, but it's interesting that some MPs have actually actively campaigned against Brexit. You'd sort of imagine that, if a referendum is held, a free and fair referendum, and you've got the outcome, that to a certain extent, parliamentarians might be obliged to sort of, almost duty bound, I suppose, on some level, to sort of see it through and not necessarily go, well, actually, this is how we'll interpret this now, I suppose, to some degree. But having said that, I am as conflicted personally as the country is, I think. But yeah, there we go. Also, I just wanted to make a point on the media. I mean, we're talking about apologising. I think I missed it, so I'm half in, half out. But most of the media, there's a large section of the media that called it right and actively campaigned for Brexit. So, sort of talking about being out of touch, I mean, probably for people who are pro-EU sort of slavishly, that's true, but certainly there are big sections of the media that didn't get it wrong. And, that's just that's just
yes, I
that,
think
I suppose.
they just want Brexit to happen actually now rather than.
Well, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Although they've lost a champion in Paul Dacre and some others, so it does
lost a champion, gained a prime minister. I think with their probable analysis of that. Right now, I do have to draw things to a conclusion because Agatha has put up her flag, which means that we reach the end of the hour. And my goodness, so much ground covered. I can't possibly hope to summarise it all, but I will try not to say nothing, which is most important. I think Robin kicked off with a very strong and stark sense of the stakes in all this, in that he said there is the potential for civil war. And I have to say that's not, in all fairness to Robin, that's not the first time I've heard that said in all sorts of contexts in the last few months. And so whilst I'm not predicting violence, I do think that it's extraordinary. We've gone from where we were in 2013 when Cameron first announced his intention to hold an in-out referendum to October 2019, where these kinds of possibilities are being widely discussed. The language is extraordinarily heated. Jakob made the point that, quoting a colleague, that the tectonic plates are moving, and they surely are. I think anyone who is still complacent about what's going on is deluding themselves, and my impression is very few people are indeed. Philip talked about an institutional crisis, and that clearly is very much at the heart of all this, and indeed may be something that outlasts the Brexit crisis. It is so deep, I think. At Tortoise, we're embarking upon a project called The Rules, which is to try and we'll go out into the country and talk to people about what they think has gone wrong, because something that has come up in our explorations of the possibility of a codified constitution is that this goes much deeper, and is a sense that the rules are in themselves obsolete or not applied fairly, and that the Brexit moment was very much about an anger around that, and that this is not just about reforming the House of Lords or the electoral system, that it goes a lot deeper, and we hope to be generating some fairly deep dive journalism on that quite quickly. Mira mentioned, again, related to that, the whole question of democratic norms being now very much up for grabs and volatile. And I was very interested in that context by Christabel's data analysis, where it was clear that when you draw people's attention to the fact that democratic norms don't necessarily favour one side, the attitude towards them can change quite quickly. And I think that there's a kind of, that's a micro example of a macro fact, which is that democratic norms are not there to protect one side or the other, but precisely the opposite, to ensure that they can both coexist. And we forget that at our peril. On the content of Brexit, I was struck by Jill's point, both that we should be very careful about being played by Dominic Cummings and his acolytes, but also that in the Juncker letter there is this extraordinary phrase, which I had forgotten about actually, about the kind of relationship that lies ahead out of all of this. And I do think that we need to bear this in mind, that if Johnson gets his way, the kind of relationship that Britain has with the rest of Europe will be radically different to what was planned by his predecessor. In other words, those who accuse Johnson of being May 2.0 or a slightly tougher version of May are quite wrong. This is an entirely different approach, and again, we shouldn't forget that. But it was intriguing to me, and I suppose inevitable after all the interesting conversations you've been having today about how much of the conversation focused on the media, and there were so many good points made about it. Kay talked about the way that we kind of looked at, we report these issues as if we were sports reporters, and that really wasn't going to be enough for the public, particularly in a moment of intensity and emergency, and I think that's a point well made. I was also struck by what Mark said about, his children and Instagram and WhatsApp, a point that was echoed elsewhere, that really it's incredibly important for people who've been reared on or work in or continue to rely upon the mainstream media not to assume that is the fundamental location of news and media and so on. I felt very much in agreement in what Matt said about the fact that it's so easy to accuse the 18 to 34-year-old bracket of being apathetic, but actually, if you talk to people in that bracket, they're full of interest in these subjects. They just don't necessarily think that they're being well served by traditional sources. So whether or not we move to a kind of apology culture or not, what is certainly the case, I think, in terms of the media and the lessons to be drawn from the Brexit era, is that a new settlement is required. And I suspect that this will involve not either or, but the capacity of the legacy media and social media and the various platforms we've discussed to interact. And I suspect also that the same will be true of representative direct democracy. I've heard this very interesting thinking about ways in which MPs can use electronic media in order to remain in touch with their constituents in a way that doesn't involve email, but it is a much more active means of finding out what people are thinking at any one time about a particular issue. And that these are, what's interesting in all of this is that the vistas that have been opened up by one speech given at Bloomberg by David Cameron 6 years ago are so great that although he has taken a tremendous kicking for holding the referendum, I suspect that there was going to be some sort of reckoning like this at some point involving institutions, media, geopolitics, and their interrelationship. And it's happening now, and it is something that, to return to the original question of the ThinkIn, is going to be certainly still occupying us a year from today. But as to today, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your contributions. If you're interested in Tortoise, do look us up online, do talk to Ellie and myself of ways of joining. We'd love you to become part of us. We are a members organisation. Our members are what we are, and they help us make the news. Meanwhile, give yourself a hearty round of applause, and thank you very much for coming.